The world had been waiting for that day. The 15th of August, 2025. They called it a dawn of peace, a turning point in modern history. The meeting of Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in Alaska was supposed to soothe the wounds of years of unrest, wars, and shattered alliances. Broadcasters decorated their words with hope, their voices full of rehearsed optimism, repeating over and over that this summit would be a breakthrough. You would have felt it too, that heavy air of anticipation, like waiting for a storm that no one wanted to admit was forming behind the clouds. But for the man sitting alone in his study, in a leather armchair worn by time, the atmosphere felt different. The television filled the room with the glow of cameras and flashes, commentators shifting from one prediction to another. Yet in his chest, a small spark of unease had been burning since morning. It was not ordinary worry. It was not even skepticism. It was like smoke drifting into a room from an unseen fire. You know that sensation when your body reacts before your mind catches up, when something inside you whispers, "Look closer, this is not what it seems." That whisper had followed him all day, and now, as the leaders shook hands and smiled stiffly for the cameras, the whisper rose into a low hum of warning. His eyes locked on their faces. Trump's jaw clenched slightly at each question. Putin's stare seemed colder than the Arctic winds outside. To the world, they were architects of a new peace, but their eyes betrayed something else. Calculation, distance, a silent war behind the smiles. It was subtle, yet undeniable. The man leaned closer, unable to shake the thought that this was not a meeting of reconciliation but a contest of wills. The screen showed unity. His heart felt division. The pendulum clock on the wall ticked with unnerving regularity, louder than usual, as though time itself was emphasizing each second. The curtains shifted gently with a faint draft, carrying in the smell of dust and wood polish. Everything in the room was familiar, ordinary, grounding, yet the sense of foreboding made even the smallest details stand out. He noticed the grain of the desk, the flicker of light on the brass lamp, the faint creak of the armchair when he shifted his weight. It was as though his senses were sharpening, preparing him for something beyond his comprehension. And then came the heat. It began in his chest, a sudden bloom of fire that spread with alarming speed. His hand instinctively reached toward his heart. Fear of illness, stabbing his mind. Was this a heart attack? The end of his earthly life? His legs tried to lift him, but they betrayed him, heavy and unresponsive. He sank deeper into the armchair, unable to move. The pressure mounted, pushing him down, immobilizing him. But even as panic threatened to consume him, a strange clarity entered his mind. He was aware of every sound, every breath, every tick of the clock. Fear was real, yes, but it was interwoven with something else: expectation. The television kept running, voices of journalists filling the air, yet all he heard was the thundering of his own pulse. And then the light came, not from the screen, not from the lamp. It poured into the room without a source, a living brightness that left no shadow, filling every corner with pulsating radiance. His skin prickled, as though touched by a million tiny currents. The fire in his chest transformed no longer pain, but a deep peace, overwhelming, steady, like water dousing the flames of fear. He understood in an instant that this was not death's hand upon him. It was something beyond, something holy. You would have trembled too, caught between awe and surrender. In that light, reality itself seemed to bend, the ordinary room dissolving into a stage for a revelation that the cameras in Alaska would never capture. While the world celebrated handshakes, the unseen was breaking into his life. The unease in his spirit was no mistake. It had been a preparation. His vision blurred, but not from weakness. It was as if his eyes were being adjusted to perceive what human sight cannot. He tried to resist, clinging for a moment to the familiar world around him, but the light was irresistible, pulling him gently yet firmly. And within that brilliance, a figure emerged, majestic yet tender, towering yet intimate. Even before his mind could form the word, his heart knew Jesus. The study, the television, the summit in Alaska all seemed to drift into insignificance. A greater story was about to unfold, one hidden from the eyes of nations, but entrusted to a single witness. The world thought peace was being brokered in Alaska. He was about to see the war behind the curtain. And you, if you had been there, if you had felt the same trembling, the same warmth piercing your very soul, you would know too. History was not being written by men at a table, but by forces far greater, invisible to cameras, yet more real than stone. The first veil was lifting, and what would be revealed would shatter illusions and mark forever the destiny of nations. The light thickened, not blinding but living, moving, as though it breathed. You know when the sun breaks through clouds after a storm, and the air feels charged, humming with freshness. Multiply that by eternity. That was what filled the room. The man no longer felt the weight on his chest. Instead, a peace soaked into him, mingled with an energy that made every cell of his being vibrate. It was not warmth alone, it was power clothed in gentleness. In the center of that radiance, a shape took form, slowly at first, then clear, undeniable. The presence was not an image, not a painted Christ from a cathedral wall, but a living figure, near enough that you could imagine feeling the pulse in his wrist, close enough that the gravity of his gaze wrapped around you like a cloak. Jesus stood before him. His face carried no mask of earthly politics or pretense. It was majesty without arrogance, tenderness without weakness, justice without cruelty. His eyes, deep, endless, unsearchable, looked straight into the man's soul. And for the first time in his life, he felt utterly seen, completely known. You might think fear would overwhelm in that moment, but it did not. Instead, there was surrender, as if every defense, every self-justification, every excuse melted away. His hand reached out not by will, but by compulsion of love, and Jesus grasped it. The hold was unlike any human touch. It bypassed flesh and bone, reaching into the marrow of his essence, binding him not with chains, but with assurance. No demon, no storm, no deception could break that grip. He realized, with trembling certainty, that he no longer had control. And strangely, that was freedom. Then the voice came. Not sound, not syllables, but vibration. Imagine thunder rolling through the earth, but instead of shaking stones, it inscribed truth on your soul. "Come," he said, and though the lips moved, the words were more than speech. They were law, engraving themselves inside, undeniable, unforgettable. "I will show you the truth that no man will tell you." The man's breath caught. His body slumped in the chair, yet he was no longer in that room. The study, the television, the armchair, all of it receded, becoming like a distant painting. He was leaving the world behind, torn from the veil of flesh into something far larger. The sensation was both terrifying and exhilarating, like standing on the edge of a cliff and leaping, yet knowing hands stronger than the universe would catch you. The rushing void gave way, and suddenly he stood not in light alone, but in a place of shadow. His heart pounded not from fear of death, but from the anticipation of revelation. You could almost taste the metallic edge in the air, the stillness that comes before lightning cracks the sky. Every sense sharpened, every breath deliberate. He knew he had crossed into a realm where truth would be shown without disguise. As he blinked, the new space resolved. Walls of dark material that absorbed sound, a low ceiling with pale, sickly lamps, an oval table gleaming like oil. And seated there, Trump, Putin. They were no longer performing for cameras. Their gestures were stiff, unnatural, as though someone else was moving their strings. The man realized this was not Alaska's summit broadcast to the world, but a deeper summit, hidden from human eyes, veiled from journalists, yet more decisive than any treaty. His skin prickled, his breath shallow. He had been brought behind the curtain, to see what no television would ever reveal. But Jesus was still beside him, steady, unshaken. The same hand that lifted him held firm on his shoulder. You can imagine the comfort, like standing in a storm while an anchor holds you from being swept away. Every part of him wanted to recoil, yet the Lord's presence steadied his gaze. He was not here to run, he was here to witness. For the world outside, peace was being declared. But here, in this place, the first movement of a darker symphony was beginning. The man felt the whisper from earlier return, but now it was no longer a whisper. It was thunder, clothed in certainty. Something had been set in motion, and it would touch every life on this planet. And you who listen, you would have felt it too. The ground of history shifting beneath your feet, the false glitter stripped away, the realization that battles are not decided by ink on treaties, but by voices, unseen yet commanding, whispering from shadows into ears of power. He knew he had been called to see. You are being called to hear. The silence in that chamber was heavier than stone. The air pressed against the skin, thick with an odor like sulfur mixed with iron, sharp enough to sting the nose. The oval table gleamed as if oiled with shadow, and two men, Trump and Putin, sat stiffly, their movements strange, unnatural, as though pulled by threads invisible. They were not leaders here. They were instruments. Their eyes darted, their lips tightened, but they spoke no words of their own. Their presence was swallowed in something greater, something darker. Then the movement began. At first, only the faintest shift in the shadows at the edges of the room, but soon the figures emerged. They were massive, twice the height of any man, their bodies swollen, glistening with an oily black sheen. Horns bent downward like broken crowns, faces stretched too long, mouths filled with rows of thin, needle-like teeth. Their limbs scraped as they moved, each step sending a vibration through the floor, like the earth itself recoiled from their weight. They breathed heavily, and with each exhale came clouds of dense vapor, smoke that writhed across the table, curling around the feet of the leaders. You would have shuddered. These were not phantoms of imagination, not creatures of a nightmare fading with dawn. They were real, solid, terrifying, and they were not idle. One leaned close to Trump, its swollen lips hovering just above his ear. From its mouth poured a language guttural, alien, yet in the spirit perfectly understood. Orders, commands, instructions, the dripping poison of hell disguised as counsel. Another reached its claw over Putin's shoulder, brushing him like a master reassuring his servant, fingers digging into the invisible threads of his will. The man felt his stomach twist, nausea rising as if bile itself answered to the stench. His knees trembled, though his body no longer belonged to him. He wanted to cry out, to look away, but Jesus' hand remained on his shoulder, steady as bedrock, and the nausea dissolved, peace flooding where despair threatened. The Lord's voice cut through the heaviness, not loud but unyielding. These are the real advisors, not the men at the table, but those who move behind them. Decisions are not born in chambers of light, but in places like this, where darkness reigns unchecked. The man turned his gaze, and the horror multiplied. Dozens more lurked in corners, clinging to the ceiling like grotesque bats, their wings folded, their eyes glowing faintly like embers waiting for breath. Some slithered down, wrapping their hands around pens, touching papers, staining every object they grazed. Each touch left a mark, a subtle blackening, as though the very tools of negotiation absorbed corruption. He realized, trembling, that treaties, documents, signatures, all were already poisoned before ink touched them. The demons feasted, not on food but on emotion. Their bodies swelled as they inhaled greed, hatred, and pride, drinking deeply from the hearts of men like invisible parasites. The more they consumed, the more their eyes glowed with that sickly, predatory light. It was vampirism of the spirit, and every gulp bent the leader's wills further into chains unseen. And you would have felt the dread too, that helpless recognition that what you see on news screens is only a mask, while the true play unfolds in realms few dare to witness. The man's hands shook, though he no longer held control over them. One of the towering figures paused in its pacing, its molten stone skin cracking with veins of fire. Its head turned slowly, and its eyes two pits of burning coals locked onto him. For a moment, he knew he had been noticed. His breath caught. Panic surged. But Jesus' hand pressed gently into his shoulder, anchoring him. "Do not fear. They cannot touch you while you are with me." The words were assurance, a shield wrapping around him like armor. Still, the reality settled heavy in his heart. This was not symbolic. This was not metaphor. The rulers of earth were not free. They were puppets, their strings pulled by claws and whispers, their decisions guided by hunger not their own. The world cheered for peace outside. But inside, at the core, a darker war scripted the next chapters of history. He felt the truth sear itself into his being. What the nation celebrated was a stage play. The real plot was being written in shadows. The demons gathered tighter, circling the table. Their guttural murmurs intertwined, weaving into a chorus of dissonance, like 1,000 voices chanting in a language not made for human throats. Papers trembled, the table vibrated, and a weight fell over the room like an invisible storm. Then, from their chorus, an image began to form, a map, suspended in the air, glowing red as if drawn in blood. The man's breath caught, for he knew this was the next revelation, the next unveiling of truth. And you would not have looked away either. You would have felt the pull of dread, yes, but also the certainty that to witness was to understand. For without sight, how can one warn? Without warning, how can one prepare? The chamber of shadows had opened, and what it showed would mark not only the fate of nations, but the souls of all who dwell upon the earth. The air above the table quivered as if heated by an invisible fire. Slowly, a shape flickered into being, not projected by human hands or machines, but summoned by the chorus of guttural voices that rattled the chamber. A map, vast and alive, floated in the darkness. Its continents were not drawn in familiar colors. They were shaded in shadows, pulsing with veins of crimson light. It looked less like geography and more like a body, a diseased heart pumping blood through swollen arteries. The man leaned forward, though every instinct told him to recoil. Thin red lines pulsed across the globe, connecting cities and nations like capillaries filled with fire. With each pulse, they glowed brighter, then dimmed, as though breathing. He realized with dread clarity that this was not simply a map of land and water. It was the skeleton of the world's future, laid bare and bleeding. One of the towering demons, gray-veined skin glowing faintly like molten rock, raised its claw. Its finger was long, sharp, and glistened like a blade. It dragged the claw across Russia, and the voice that came was like an earthquake whispering through bone. One more year of war. Then, it will fall into misery. The decree did not echo like sound. It lodged itself in the marrow of the man's spirit. Immediately the map shifted. Russia's outline darkened, its cities collapsing into skeletal ruins, its streets filled with hollow-eyed children, refugees trudging along endless roads, wrapped in tattered blankets. Their hunger, their despair, fed the darkness that swelled around the demon's chest. The man clutched his stomach, nausea rising, until Jesus pressed his hand on his shoulder again, dissolving the sickness with peace. The demon's words had not been prediction, they were law, sentences spoken into being. And the man understood. Wars did not end because treaties were signed. Wars ended or began because decrees were issued in places like this, beyond the view of cameras, where shadows wrote destiny in red. Then the map shifted west. The red lines thickened, swelling around America like veins about to burst. The glow grew so bright it stung the eyes. Jesus' voice cut through the darkness, solemn yet steady. When Russia is reduced to weakness, America will advance. Not for peace, not for justice, but to tighten its chains across the earth. As he spoke, the vision expanded: military alliances, financial contracts, cultural currents, all converging into a single tightening net. Piece by piece, territory after territory fell beneath the expanding glow of American influence. It was not a kingdom of liberty. It was control dressed in the costume of freedom. The only place resisting, the man noticed, was China. Around it, An even darker circle pulsed, figures moving in its shadow, preparing for their own collision. The map grew restless, flickering with intermittent flashes over the Middle East and Africa. Smaller demons slithered closer, whispering in their fractured tongue, and those regions lit up like sparks on dry tinder. Chaos there would be fuel, diversions, tools of destabilization. The man's throat tightened. He realized war was not the endgame. War was only the knife. The true goal was chaos itself. For chaos breeds desperation, and desperation cries for a savior. But the savior offered in such moments is never the one sent from heaven. It is the counterfeit, the deceiver, cloaked in light. You can feel it too, can't you? The truth pressing in, the recognition that what seems random on the news, wars, collapses, unrest, is not random at all. It is orchestrated. Every move etched first in this unseen map, every decree spoken by voices not of flesh, but of spirit. The man shivered, yet he could not look away. This was knowledge bought with terror, but it was knowledge the world would need. The demons pressed closer, their shadows bending against the walls, their whispers weaving into a rising chant. The map pulsed faster, the red veins quickening like the heartbeat of a dying patient. The man wanted to cry out, but Jesus' calm steadied him. "Remember," the Lord whispered, "what you see is not for despair, but for warning. Few will believe, but some will hear, and for those, you must speak." The weight of it settled like stone in the man's chest. He knew that after this vision, life would never return to what it had been. He had been given sight into the machinery of hell itself, the levers pulled by claws unseen. The world would go on applauding handshakes and treaties, blind to the strings that guided them. But he had seen the strings, the puppeteers, the red map, the bleeding veins. And you who hear this now cannot unsee it either. The map flickered once more, its glow swelling as if about to explode, then collapsed into smoke, leaving only the table, the demons, and the suffocating dark. The man gasped as though surfacing from underwater. His heart raced, his palms burned with sweat. Yet Jesus remained, unshaken, his hand steady, his eyes unblinking. The next revelation was coming. The darkness thinned into a metallic blue, the kind of color you see in a screen's glow after midnight. The chamber vanished, and suddenly the world stretched beneath like an ocean of moving points, cities breathing, highways ribbing the land, neighborhoods pulsing in faint, restless light. You would have held your breath here. It felt as if the sky itself leaned down, and in that tilt, you could see the subtle web most people never notice. The quiet net stretched over hearts like frost, invisible until the dawn. From above, thin threads descended, delicate, translucent, endless. At first, they looked like gentle rays. Then the man saw the truth. They were living cords, slow, searching, slipping toward foreheads and necks, fastening where thought becomes desire, and desire becomes habit. He followed them with his eyes and found the altar they served. Not stone, not gold screens. Towers of pixels. Tablets resting on bedsides. Televisions humming in empty rooms. Phones cradled in lonely hands. The cords pulsed faintly as they connected, like roots tasting soil. And once anchored, they tightened, never with violence, always with persuasion. He looked closer and saw movement behind the screens. Not code, not graphs, shadows with jointed fingers and headless torsos, faceless shapes turning knobs that had no names. They worked in rhythms, measuring pauses, predicting next choices, offering a perfect flicker at the exact second a restless mind would reach for it. You know that feeling when you think you chose, but something chose first, and your hand only obeyed without asking why. The shapes were not evil in the way monsters are evil. They were efficient, patient, precise. They did not shock. They soothed. Not blades, syrups. The man watched a woman smile at a video. Then, without warning, her face dimmed as a sour thought slid in like a draft under a door. A boy laughed at a clip, then his eyes glazed over with a nameless ache. Every scroll, every tap, Every second, spent looking into light that did not warm, was a drop feeding the shapes behind the glass. He realized a simple tidbit: what the body repeats, the brain rewards. The loop is not neutral. It leaves fingerprints on the soul. Hours passed in seconds. Seconds stretched into hours. People did not move. They held their breath without noticing. Food cooled on tables. Prayers turned to whispers, then fell into silence, drowned under a tide of perfectly tuned notifications. The chords thickened with each repetition, becoming soft collars that did not choke because the wearer learned to love them. You could hear the hush of it, the slow lull that makes a spirit drowsy like a lullaby that never ends. He was shown a church then, small, warm, simple. The lights were low, the wooden pews worn smooth by hands like his and yours. The believers gathered, heads bent, lips moving in prayer, and yet phones glowed between fingers, pockets, hymnals. Eyes rose for a verse, sank for a vibration. The room was full of holy words and half-heard replies. The man saw minor spirits drift easily among them, small as moths. Wing light, settling on shoulders, whispering the gentlest suggestions. Just a glance, just a check, just one more. Divided attention is the softest doorway. The spirits did not pry. They waited for the invitation of distraction. When the heart splits, the door cracks. When the door cracks, visitors arrive. The man's chest ached. He remembered the map, the decree, the coming savior, and understood the chain's purpose. It was not merely to waste hours. It was to dull the ears that must hear a trumpet, dim the eyes that must lift when the sky opens. When the moment arrives, many will miss it, not through hatred, but through habit. Not rebellion, but saturation. You felt the weight of that too, didn't you? Not condemnation, warning. Like a hand on your shoulder in a crowded station, steering you toward the right train, a heartbeat before the doors close. The cords swayed, and he followed them into homes. A kitchen with a sink full of plates and a phone propped against a water glass. A bedroom haloed in blue, where a little girl stared at cartoons while her father scrolled through headlines. Both of them near and far, near and far. The room humming and empty at the same time. A grandmother alone on a couch, her eyes shining with tears as the moving light gave her company but not comfort. The chords did not fight family. They simply replaced it. The gentlest forms kept appearing, steam rising from a forgotten cup of tea, dust drifting in a window beam, the slow sway of a curtain breathing. The world's softness remained, but human attention was elsewhere, magnetized by the continual call of more. The man realized that more is not abundance. More is a whirlpool. Abundance looks up and says thank you. More looks in and asks again. He felt a tremor of grief. Not a loud grief, a thin one. The kind you taste when you wake and remember you forgot to pray the night before, and the morning feels colder than it should. He wanted to shout, to rip cords from 1,000 necks, to yank phones from 1,000,000 hands. But a different wisdom unfolded. No chain broken from the outside stays broken. The heart must choose to loosen its own knot. Jesus stood near him. The same steady presence from the chamber. The same unshakable peace. Light pooled around his feet like clear water. The cords near him wilted, recoiling from a warmth they couldn't mimic. The man understood light that warms is different from light that captures. Heat that heals is different from heat that numbs. Genuine presence turns glass into ash. The simplest practices, the old ones, taught silence before dawn. A psalm carried in the mouth, a whispered surrender while washing a plate. These scratch the chords until they fray. He saw then a small gathering in a living room. 3 families, a single candle, a Bible cradled like bread. Their phones rested face down in a bowl by the door. No rule, just reverence. A song rose soft and off-key, and it sounded like home. A child laughed at the wrong time, and no one hushed her. When they prayed, the air changed, the kind of change you can't photograph but you feel on your skin, like walking from shade into Sunday. The cords outside the window hovered and then drifted elsewhere. denied by a house that had decided its rhythm. The man turned back to the city-wide web and knew what must be spoken. Prepare your senses. Feed your attention to what is holy until it grows teeth and chooses for you when you are tired. Train your eyes to recognize warmth from glitter. Train your hands to set down what hums but does not heal. Train your ears to rise when he calls in the night. This is not rejection of the world, it is rescue of the heart. And rescue, like all real love, begins quietly. A hush fell. The chords slowed, thin as spider silk at dawn. The city breathed. The man felt a pulse under his feet, a reminder that time still moves, that a trumpet still waits its hour, that a bridegroom still comes like a thief when the wise keep oil. He gathered the tidbit he had learned as if it were a seed. Repetition writes grooves, and grooves guide feet. Write new grooves now, before the wind rises, before the doors close. The metallic blue dimmed, and with it the web of threads, until only the Lord's light remained, soft as a mother's hand brushing hair from a child's forehead, sure as a father's arm catching a stumbling step. The next vision, he knew, would be jagged. But this one had shown the quiet battlefield, the one where so many fall without ever hearing a shot. The glow of the threads faded, and with it, the comfort of the small, faithful gathering he had glimpsed. Darkness returned, heavy, oppressive. Only this time it was not spiritual chains he saw, but a storm mounting in the world's foundations. The ground shifted beneath his feet, and when his eyes opened, he stood before a wall of screens. Not a few televisions, but an entire horizon of monitors stretching like an electronic sky. Each one showed graphs, green lines soaring upward, analysts grinning, numbers climbing as though prosperity itself had been carved into stone. The atmosphere buzzed with frenetic energy, the kind of thrill that lives in trading floors, in banks, in boardrooms where money is not paper but pulse. At first, the man thought it was just another scene from the world he already knew. Markets climbing, voices shouting about gains, the illusion of security. But then, his ears caught it, a ticking. Not loud, but steady, like a countdown inside his skull. His gaze lifted, and there it was, suspended in the void above. A colossal digital clock, its red numbers glaring like firebrands. 5 hours. No second hand, no sound of gears, yet every blink of those numbers struck harder than thunder. With each shift, his temples throbbed, as if the world itself was bound to that clock's heartbeat. He tried to look away, but the moment he blinked, the hours dissolved faster. 5 turned to 4, 4 to 3. The monitors flickered. Traders shouted louder. Phones rang with urgency. The green lines quivered. Then the clock struck 0. It happened like an avalanche. All at once, every line that had risen with pride bent downward like a spine snapped in half. Green bled into red, the screens pulsing like wounds. The numbers tumbled so quickly they blurred, as though gravity itself had been turned against the economy. Traders panicked, some screamed into phones, others pulled at their hair, others froze with terror glazing their eyes. A man in his 50s stared in silence as his life savings evaporated, a single tear tracing his cheek while his knuckles whitened against the desk. Families watching at home gasped as their bank accounts dwindled before their eyes. Zeros vanishing, balances collapsing into dust. Mothers cried out. Fathers collapsed into chairs. Children looked on, not yet able to understand but sensing their world had cracked. The man's heart clenched. He saw the fear, not only of wealth lost, but of stability undone. It was not merely money, it was trust. Trust that tomorrow's bread would come. Trust that the hours of labor meant something. Trust that systems were safe. And as that trust crumbled, cities convulsed with panic. Crowds stormed banks, only to find ATMs dead, screens coldly declaring "Operation Unavailable." Stores shuttered, alarms rang, lines stretched in frantic knots. The invisible pillar propping millions of lives shattered in an instant, and the chaos was not just economic, it was spiritual. Jesus stood beside him, sorrow etching his face, yet his voice was steady. This will happen in a single day, and it will begin in America. The words dropped like stones into the man's chest. He realized the avalanche was not a cycle of markets or an accident of policy. It was decree, and once unleashed, it spread like fire across dry fields. Europe trembling, Asia convulsing, Africa groaning. No nation was untouched. Fear flowed faster than currency ever had. The man noticed a deeper truth. The collapse was not designed to empty wallets, it was meant to empty hearts. He saw families turning against one another. A father accused by his son of losing everything. Brothers suing each other for inheritance. Spouses splitting under the weight of despair. Greed, once disguised as ambition, erupted into blame and bitterness. Shadows slithered into living rooms, coiling around throats, whispering, "Save yourself. Trust no one. Protect only your own." Love withered, replaced by suspicion. Unity fractured, and where division opened, demons entered freely. Yet, not all succumbed. The vision shifted to a dim room where families gathered around a wooden table. Bread broken, oil lamp flickering, prayers whispered. They had little, yet their eyes carried peace absent from the wealthiest palaces. Jesus' gaze turned toward them and softened. "These will not fall," he said, "for their wealth is not here." The contrast struck like lightning. While nations drowned in panic, a remnant stood, their treasure untouchable, their anchor unshaken. "You can feel it too, can't you?" The quiet nudge inside, warning that security built on accounts and contracts is fragile as glass. That a single decree, unseen by men but heard in places of shadow, could unravel it in a day. This is not fantasy, it is preparation. To cling to what crumbles is to crumble with it. To cling to what endures is to endure through it. The man felt his breath catch, his chest heavy. He wanted to look away from the screens, from the faces twisted by despair, but Jesus kept his gaze steady. "You are not shown this for fear," the Lord said, "but for readiness. Warn them. Few will believe, but some will hear. And those who hear will stand." The red glow of the collapsing numbers, reflected in his eyes. Yet in them, no fear, only certainty. The scene quaked, the monitors dissolving into dust, the clock vanishing like smoke swept by wind. The man staggered, heart pounding. He had seen wars decreed, chains of screens binding souls, and now a crash that would shake the globe in one day. He realized each revelation was not separate. They were pieces of a design, threads of a net tightening around humanity. The next unveiling pressed against the darkness, waiting to break through. The man's spirit felt raw, scraped by the collapse he had just witnessed. The cries of parents watching their accounts empty still echoed in his ears. He longed for silence, but the vision refused to release him. Darkness deepened again, and this time it throbbed with voices, not shouts of traitors, but voices inside homes, sharper and more intimate. He found himself standing in a modest living room where a family of 4 sat around a table. Papers lay scattered, bank statements, notices, debts. The father's fist slammed down, rattling a glass. His voice was jagged with anger. "It's gone. Everything's gone." The mother's hands trembled, clutching the statement as tears streaked her face. Their teenage son erupted, accusing his father of failing them. His sister joined in, bitterness spilling like acid. In moments, the house filled not with mourning, but with accusation. Love dissolved into suspicion. Trust, once invisible but firm, shattered like thin glass. The vision shifted. A law office, 2 brothers, grown men, seated at opposite ends of a polished table. Each had a lawyer by his side. They had once played together, shared childhood secrets. Yet now they avoided each other's gaze. The air between them was colder than stone. They signed documents severing an inheritance, dividing not only property but blood itself. Behind them, shadows writhed like snakes, feeding on the fracture, multiplying with each signature. The man watching felt a pang in his heart, realizing that money had not only stolen wealth, it had stolen brotherhood. Another room unfolded. A young couple in a dim kitchen. The wife clutched a suitcase, her eyes wet but resolute. "If we stay together, we'll never get back up," she said. "I have to think of my future." The husband stood in silence, shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on the floor. She walked out, the door clicking shut with a finality louder than any scream. The silence that followed was heavier than grief. It was the silence of love abandoned for fear of lack. House after house, scene after scene rushed past him. Fathers disowning children over ruined savings. Wives and husbands turning their backs, consumed by obsession with recovery. People gambling what little they had on reckless schemes, sinking further into ruin. The man's chest burned with sorrow. He understood the truth etched into each scene. Money had become idol, and idols always demand sacrifice. Sacrifice of family, sacrifice of peace, sacrifice of soul. Jesus' voice broke through, solemn, weighted. When money becomes an idol, the enemy enters without knocking. The words pierced like an arrow, undeniable. The man lifted his eyes and saw a scale suspended in the heavens. On one side lay coins and banknotes. On the other, human faces, parents, children, brothers, lovers. The side with money rose, feather light, while the side with faces sank heavy, crushed by resentment and loss. He understood in his bones. It was not the markets that destroyed families. It was idolatry that eroded them from within. Yet amid the grief, another vision emerged. A small gathering, humble, stripped of wealth. Families huddled in a bare room. A wooden table, a single oil lamp, a loaf of bread broken into pieces. They had almost nothing, yet their voices rose in prayer. Their faces glowed with quiet joy. A boy shared his shoes with a barefoot man. A woman divided her last slice of bread with a neighbor. An old man comforted children not his own. Their eyes held no fear, only peace. Jesus gestured toward them. "These will not fall, for their wealth is not here." His words lifted the man's heart like a candle lit in darkness. The contrast was stark. The world crumbled under the idol of wealth, but those rooted in him endured, their treasure untouched. You can feel the weight of it too, can't you? The warning humming like a wire through your chest. When the ground shifts, will your foundation be sand or stone? Families divided by greed became prey for shadows. But families gathered in prayer became fortresses invisible to the world. The man realized that the crisis was not economic at its core. It was spiritual. The collapse was only the spark. The real fire burned in hearts that loved gold more than God. The vision spread wider cities filled with shouting, courts choked with lawsuits, homes locked in silence. Yet scattered among them, small lights glowed, hidden households of faith, small circles of prayer, voices whispering hymns in dim rooms. They were few, but they burned steady. He felt the Spirit whisper, "Do not fear the shaking. Fear the idols that will be revealed in the shaking. Those who cling to idols will crumble with them. Those who cling to me will shine when all else falls." The man's tears fell freely now. He no longer fought them. He knew what was being shown was not merely for him, but for all who would listen. The world would mock, scoff, dismiss him as fanatic. But some would hear, and those few, those scattered seeds, would be the remnant that remained when the storm consumed the rest. He clutched that truth to his heart like a lifeline, steadying himself as the vision blurred once more, preparing him for the face of the deceiver yet to come. The next vision unfolded like a broadcast, every screen in every city tuned to the same image. The man blinked, and suddenly he was standing in the middle of a sea of televisions, phones, tablets, each one glowing with a single face. It was a man's face, handsome in a way that seemed deliberate, sculpted, almost too perfect. His smile was calm, reassuring, measured. His voice rolled like warm honey, speaking of peace, of unity, of a new beginning for the world. He promised an end to wars, a cure for hunger, prosperity for all nations. And as he spoke, people everywhere wept with joy, clapped their hands, even dropped to their knees in worship before the light of a screen. At first glance, he seemed like the savior humanity had been begging for. But the man's spirit recoiled. Beneath the smooth words, beneath the polished gestures, there was a chill. His eyes shone, but not with truth. They gleamed like blades reflecting moonlight, sharp, dangerous, deceptive. The man felt the same weight in his chest that he had felt in the secret chamber with the demons. Behind the face, behind the words, was a shadow. It wrapped him like a cloak, vast and oppressive, its hands stretching invisibly into every home, every government, every church. The man trembled, but Jesus leaned close. They were seeds waiting under the soil, hidden until the appointed rain. Then the vision turned, and he saw great buildings filled with thousands, shining lights, booming music, preachers promising prosperity and safety, success and comfort. The people clapped and cheered, yet their roots were shallow. Jesus' voice hardened. They have me on their lips but not in their hearts. When the trial comes, they will run to the world for refuge, and they will fall. The man felt sorrow like a stone in his chest. The contrast pierced him. Small gatherings in obscurity carried the flame, while multitudes in grandeur carried only smoke. He understood a tidbit then. Numbers do not equal strength. What endures is not the size of the crowd but the depth of the root. The remnant did not glitter, yet their light could not be extinguished. They were lamps in the night, humble and hidden, but brighter than stadiums filled with noise. Their wealth was not in accounts, but in Christ. Their hope was not in the Antichrist's promises, but in God's word lived out in bread broken, in songs whispered, in hearts unyielding. You can almost see them, can't you? A mother rocking her child by candlelight while reciting psalms, a boy humming a hymn while carrying water up a dusty path, a grandfather bowing his head over a cracked table, thanking God for a crust of bread. These are the ones who will endure. These are the ones heaven calls rich. And though the world may call them invisible, their names are etched into eternity. The man's heart swelled with both grief and hope. Grief for the many who would bow to the false savior, mistaking lies for light. Hope for the few who would cling to truth when the world mocked them. Jesus looked at him, eyes solemn, yet burning with compassion. Salvation will not belong to those who appear holy, but to those who live in obedience. Not those who seek recognition, but those who remain faithful in secret. Not those who chase crowns on earth, but those who hold the cross. The man bowed his head. He knew then that the remnant was not chosen by strength, but by surrender. Their power was not their own, but God's Spirit burning in weakness. They were the hidden lanterns, the last lights in a world giving itself to darkness. And when the storm would come, these lights would not be extinguished. They would be gathered, kept, and lifted, for their treasure was not in what crumbles, but in what endures forever. The silence returned, deep and thick. He knew it was not the end. Another vision waited, one that would pierce deeper still. But the image of the remnant burned steady in his heart, a reminder that even when the world bowed to deception, God's faithful would remain, scattered yet unbroken, hidden yet shining. The silence folded in on itself, and when it broke, he was back in his study. The television still flickered, commentators smiling, their voices full of promises about a breakthrough summit. But everything had changed. His chest heaved, his hands trembled, and when he looked down at his arm, he froze. Burned into his flesh was a mark, dark and twisted, as though etched by fire. The lines curled and spiraled, the same pattern he had seen glowing on the stone floor of the demon's chamber. He touched it, and pain surged like a living flame running up his veins. It was not a wound that could heal, it was a seal, a testimony written into his body. Proof that what he had seen was not dream or madness, it was revelation. He remembered every vision in a rush, the demons whispering into leaders' ears. The bleeding map, the cords of screens binding souls. The collapse of markets in one day, families torn apart, the rise of the Antichrist, the hidden remnant clinging to Christ. Each piece was not random. They were threads woven into one tapestry, a design stretching over nations and hearts alike. And the seal on his arm pulsed like a heartbeat, reminding him that time was short. He was no longer free to remain silent. He had been chosen not to admire the vision, but to carry its weight. Doubt whispered, what if it was hallucination, stress, imagination? But the burn on his flesh silenced it. Pain was truth. He could deny words, but he could not deny scars. He remembered Jesus' gaze in the moment of departure, serious, tender, urgent. Remember every detail. Time is short. Those words echoed louder than the television, louder than the clock ticking in the corner. His spirit quivered, yet deep within was resolve. He was not called to convince the world. He was called to warn those with ears to hear. He turned off the television. The journalist's smiles vanished into black. The room felt still, heavy with presence. The mark on his arm throbbed like fire, yet it steadied him. He knew ridicule would come, laughter, dismissal. Many would call him deluded. But some, yes. Some would recognize truth when they heard it. And for them, he could not stay silent. He had to speak of what he had seen. He had to prepare those who would listen. The storm was already moving. The first winds had already stirred. You can feel it too, can't you? That sense that the world is tilting toward something immense, something you cannot stop but must face. His mission became clear: to warn, to call, to awaken. Not to make the deaf hear, but to rouse the drowsy before the trumpet sounded. The remnant must be ready, oil in their lamps, eyes lifted from the glowing chains of distraction to the true light that no darkness can quench. He pressed his palm over the scar and whispered his yes, not in strength, but in surrender. Yes to being mocked, yes to being dismissed, yes to carrying the message like fire in his bones. For this was not about him. It was about souls, about eternity, about a world asleep at the edge of judgment. He had seen too much to rest. He had felt the Lord's hand steady him, heard his voice cut through the storm, and now he knew. His life was no longer his own. He had been marked not for doom, but for mission. The study seemed smaller now, the furniture pale, the television meaningless. Outside, the night stretched deep, silent, waiting. He knew he could not control how many would listen. But he also knew this. Even if one heart turned, even if one family chose Christ over chains, even if one soul woke before it was too late, then the visions had not been in vain. He closed his eyes, breathing slowly, and felt the mark pulse once more. It was not a wound. It was a warning. It was the seal of a witness. And with that, he began to prepare himself not for rest, but for the work of speaking what the world would not want to hear. And now the images blur, softening like mist over water, leaving only a steady pulse in the heart. You move along the edge of these visions, feeling their weight but also their invitation. The demons around the tables, the maps drawn in veins of blood, the chains of glowing screens, the sudden fall of money, the breaking of families, the rise of a deceiver clothed in light, all of it seems too vast to hold. Yet within the storm, there was always a thread of hope. A hand steady on the shoulder, a word cutting through fear. A remnant kneeling in quiet rooms, breaking bread, whispering psalms, their light steady even when the world bowed to shadows. If you close your eyes now, you can almost feel the hush of one of those gatherings, the creak of a wooden chair, the warmth of a candle, a child's laughter echoing in the silence. These are not grand cathedrals, but they are sanctuaries. And in them, the Spirit breathes. The Lord does not forget His own. He gathers them, seed by seed, light by light, until no darkness can claim them. So let your heart be calmed. Do not fear the visions of collapse, for collapse is only the shaking of idols. Do not despair at the rise of deception, for deception is powerless against truth lived out in faith. Your task is not to predict every step of history. Your task is to remain faithful, to love without measure, to keep oil in your lamp, and to stay awake when the world sleeps. If these words resonate with you, please leave an amen in the comments. Subscribe to the channel, and share it with at least 3 friends or family members right now. Now is your time to make a difference. Spreading this message is not only an act of love, but also a mission that Jesus himself has entrusted to you.